the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican, on the night of October 30th, 1501, the unthinkable happened. 50 nude courtesans crawled over the sacred marble floor while cardinals and bishops watched. The Pope, Alexander VI, sat on his throne, laughing over this spectacle of pure degradation. But that was merely the opening act. What followed was so shocking, so utterly devoid of human compassion, that chroniclers hesitated for centuries to document the full truth. This is the tragic history of Lucrezia Borgia, and a wedding night that did not just break her soul. It tore the veil of sanctity from the Vatican itself. This is the darkest chapter in the history of the papacy. If you are interested in history's hidden atrocities, subscribe to this channel and leave a like and write in the comments from which country you are discovering this shattering truth. Let's begin. In the autumn of the year 1501, the bells of St. Peter's rang throughout Rome. Pope Alexander VI made an announcement that would throw all of Italy into turmoil. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, would marry for the third time. She was already twice widowed under mysterious and bloody circumstances. This ceremony would not take place in some distant palace. No, it would be performed within the Vatican itself, in the papal chambers, beneath the frescoes of Michelangelo and the sacred symbols of Christianity. The groom was Alfonso d'Este, Prince of Ferrara, heir to one of the most powerful duchies in northern Italy. For Alfonso, this news felt like a death sentence. Lucrezia Borgia was notorious throughout Europe. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had claimed to have only escaped death by fleeing. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled on the steps of the Vatican, allegedly on the orders of her brother Cesare. And now, he, Alfonso d'Este, was to be the next in this murderous line. Alfonso desperately tried to escape his fate. He sent envoys to Rome with excuses and delaying tactics. He cited diplomatic obligations, family matters, everything he could think of. But Pope Alexander was not a man to accept no for an answer. In the opulent halls of the Vatican, surrounded by cardinals in scarlet robes, the Pope dictated his will. Boten rode day and night to Ferrara. The messages were unequivocal. Either the Este family accepts the alliance, Alexander's messengers warned, or the papal armies, commanded by the terrifying Cesare Borgia, will reduce Ferrara to rubble. Alexander offered territories, promised political protection, and simultaneously threatened excommunication and military annihilation. The Borgia family was at the peak of its power, and no one in Italy dared to oppose their will. Duke Ercole d'Este, Alfonso's father, recognized the futility of their situation. With a heavy heart, he ordered his son to travel to Rome and accept the poisoned alliance. While preparations for the departure were being made in Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia sat in her chambers in the Vatican, staring out the window at the eternal city. She was 21 years old, but her eyes carried the burden of a much longer life. Lucrezia was not the seductive schemer that she was portrayed as throughout Europe. She was a tool, a pawn in the ruthless game of her father and brother. Her first husband was torn from her when the political alliance was no longer useful. Her second husband, whom she had genuinely loved, was murdered, and she had watched helplessly. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she often woke up crying at night, tormented by nightmares. Her soul was not made of the stone her family demanded. It was a cage of despair. She knew that this third husband was nothing more than another political transaction. But even in her darkest imaginings, Lucrezia could not have anticipated what her father and brother had planned for her wedding night. The preparations in the Vatican were already in full swing, but they were not for a normal papal wedding. In the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, servants and cardinals whispered nervously to each other. Rumors were circulating. There was talk of strange instructions, of unusual guests being brought in through the back doors at night. The papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, seized by a growing feeling of unease. He had already witnessed many scandalous things, for Alexander VI was no ordinary pope. But what Burchard would document in the coming days would eclipse everything that had come before. In December of the year, Alfonso d'Este rode through the gates of Rome, accompanied by a small escort of Ferrarese knights. The weight on his chest was heavier than any armor. As he saw the Vatican, he knew he was entering a pact with the devil himself. The reception ceremony was overwhelming in its splendor. Pope Alexander VI sat on the papal throne. To his right stood Cesare Borgia, the notorious cardinal and military commander, whose eyes were cold as steel. Cesare's gaze upon Alfonso was both amused and threatening. "Welcome, Prince Alfonso," Cesare might have murmured, his voice deadly calm. "You are now family. Do try to stay with us." In the following weeks, Alfonso was subjected to a series of humiliations disguised as celebrations. There were banquets where he was placed next to courtesans. There were hunting excursions where Cesare demonstrated his military superiority. Alfonso was a prisoner in all but name. The political marriage is just a pretext, Alfonso realized with chilling clarity. They want to humiliate the Este family and demonstrate absolute power. While Alfonso endured this psychological torture, Cesare Borgia had personally taken charge of the planning for the wedding banquet. His visions went far beyond what was acceptable even for the decadent Roman society. In secret meetings with the Pope, details were discussed that would have filled any true Christian with horror. 50 of the most beautiful courtesans in Rome were selected. They were instructed to wear magnificent dresses, which they would later discard. The serving women who witnessed these preparations crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The air itself, they felt, was turning cold with sacrilege. Lucrezia herself was largely kept away, but she sensed the dark energy gathering. An evening before the wedding, Lucrezia fled to the Sistine Chapel. She knelt beneath Michelangelo's masterpieces and prayed with a desperation that came from the deepest soul. "God, where are you?" she may have silently begged. "Do not abandon me to their wicked ceremony." Outside, the Vatican was preparing for a feast that would completely erase the boundaries between sacred and profane, between wedding and horror. Johann Burchard sat in his office, his hand trembling as he dipped the pen. He knew what he was about to document: the unbelievable depravity in the history of the Church. The 30th of October, 1501, began with all the hallmarks of a magnificent papal wedding. The bells of St. Peter's rang at dawn. In the Apostolic Palace, Lucrezia was prepared for the ceremony. She wore a dress of gold-embroidered silk. Her face was pale as marble. As she looked in the mirror, she saw not a radiant bride, but an offering, adorned for a heathen altar. The ceremony itself took place in the papal chapel. Pope Alexander VI personally performed the marriage. His voice boomed through the room as he spoke the sacred words. Rows of cardinals lined the chapel, their faces masks of piety. But their eyes betrayed deep unease. They all knew this ceremony was only the beginning. After the ceremony, the guests were led to the Borgia apartments. The rooms were spectacular, but the atmosphere was heavy. Alfonso sat next to Lucrezia at the place of honor, both trapped in a surreal scene of conjugal solemnity. The banquet began like any other aristocratic wedding. But as the hours passed and night fell, the atmosphere began to change. The Pope, who had already consumed considerable amounts of wine, became louder and more boisterous. Cesare Borgia rose and gave a discreet order. The heavy doors of the Borgia apartments were locked. Guards were posted in front of them. No one would be able to leave until the night was over. What happened next would transcend all boundaries. At a sign from Cesare, the side doors opened and 50 courtesans entered the room. The guests fell silent. Pope Alexander rose from his throne. "The true entertainment shall now commence," he proclaimed. At his command, the courtesans began to undress until they stood completely nude before the assembled crowd. Cardinals turned their gaze away, crossed themselves. Some tried to stand up and leave, but the guards made it unmistakably clear: no one leaves. Alfonso stared in disbelief, his face a mask of horror. Lucrezia sat petrified. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Her dignity, she realized, was being publicly stripped away with every discarded gown. The nude women were then instructed to dance between the long tables. It was a surreal, nightmarish sight. Sacred religious art on the walls, cardinals and nude women dancing among them like figures from a heathen ritual. But the Pope was not finished yet. In an act of calculated humiliation, he had several baskets full of chestnuts brought into the room and scattered over the marble floor. Then Alexander VI announced the next phase. "The ladies shall now crawl on all fours between the legs of the cardinals and nobles and collect the chestnuts. Prizes will be awarded to the most successful." What followed was a scene of such grotesque degradation that Burchard would later write that he had difficulty finding the right words. 50 nude women crawled over the sacred floor, collecting chestnuts like animals. The cardinals sat with their heads bowed, unable to watch the spectacle, caught between their faith and their fear of the Pope. The silence was more deafening than any scream, a silence filled with utter moral collapse. Alfonso sat in stunned silence. Lucrezia, poor Lucrezia, was in a state of empty numbness. She had not expected her own wedding to become a spectacle of damnation. The worst was still to come. As the midnight hour approached, Pope Alexander VI rose from his seat. The banquet of the chestnuts was over. With a gesture that radiated both papal authority and paternal possessiveness, he announced his final command. He commanded Alfonso d'Este to consummate the marriage with his daughter Lucrezia 3 times that night. And this was not to happen in private. All those present were to serve as witnesses. The room fell silent in disbelieving horror. Alfonso stood up, his face pale as death. He was a prince of honor, but around the room stood Cesare's armed men. It was a command, and resistance meant certain death. Alfonso looked at Lucrezia, trembling like a trapped bird. His stomach turned to ice. He was a man forced to violate his own soul. Under the watchful eyes of Cesare's guards, Alfonso led Lucrezia into an adjoining chamber. The doors remained open. The guests were forced to stay, with a direct view of the proceedings. What happened in the following hours was a profound violation of human dignity. Alfonso, psychologically broken, performed the act under the gaze of dozens of witnesses. Lucrezia lay still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Tears streamed silently down her face. Her soul was being systematically destroyed. After the first time, Cesare Borgia personally entered the room. "The first consummation is complete," he proclaimed with clinical coldness. He then ordered Alfonso to wait and repeat it in an hour. The guests sat frozen. Cardinals mumbled prayers, unable to process the sacrilege. Some of the courtesans wept quietly in sympathy for Lucrezia. The second consummation took place in a state of utter exhaustion and despair. Alfonso moved mechanically. Lucrezia's mind had dissociated from her body, to survive the horror. And then, as the first light of dawn appeared, the Pope commanded the third and final consummation. Cesare supervised this personally, and when it was finished, he triumphantly proclaimed that the marriage was now sealed 3 times and was absolutely indissoluble. Pope Alexander laughed, raising his wine kelch to a final toast. The guests who had survived this endless night were broken people. Cardinals who had entered the Vatican as servants of God, left as accessories to a crime against humanity. As the sun rose over Rome, Lucrezia lay motionless in the bed, her mind far away from that place of horror. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, his whole body trembling. He was humiliated in a way that no revenge could ever compensate for. Within a few days, he would leave Rome, traumatized and broken, and return to Ferrara. He would never speak of that night again. The news of the banquet spread like wildfire through Rome and then throughout Europe. Envoys sent encrypted dispatches. The reports were read with incredulous horror. The ambassador of Venice wrote, "What happened in the Vatican surpasses everything that may have happened in the darkest days of the Roman Empire. The Pope has not only defiled his daughter, but the Holy Church itself." In the streets of Rome, people whispered about the Borgias. Preachers in other parts of Europe used the story as proof of Rome's corruption and as justification for the coming Reformation. Martin Luther mentioned the Borgia banquet as one of the worst examples of papal depravity. Johann Burchard, the loyal master of ceremonies, wrote everything down in his diary. He knew that this document would serve as the most shocking testimony in the history of the Church. Lucrezia Borgia would never fully recover from that night. She remained married to Alfonso d'Este, moved to Ferrara, and desperately tried to lead a normal life as a duchess. She dedicated herself to charitable works, promoted art and literature, and tried to escape the dark shadow of her name. Reports from Ferrara describe her as pious, melancholic, and marked by deep sadness. She had several children with Alfonso, but their marriage was never marked by love. Alfonso avoided her whenever possible. The trauma of the wedding night had built an insurmountable wall between them. Lucrezia died in 1519 during the birth of her 8th child. She was only 39 years old. On her deathbed, she spent her last hours in prayer. Her last words are said to have been, "I am ready, finally to be free." Pope Alexander VI died shortly after, possibly poisoned. Cesare Borgia quickly lost his power after his father's death and died in 1503 in an ambush in Spain. The night of October 30th, 1501, remains one of the darkest hours in the history of the Vatican. It was not just a story of corruption. It was a story about the complete destruction of human dignity, about the instrumentalization of people as political tools, about the absolute depravity of power. The Borgias had not only destroyed Lucrezia and Alfonso, they had stained the institution of the Church itself. The banquet became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the late medieval Church and contributed directly to the Protestant Reformation. The story of Lucrezia's wedding night is a somber reminder that the darkest chapters of history are often written in the shadows of power. If you have made it to the end of this report, write the word Borgia in the comments so I know that you have followed this tragic and shattering story completely. Never forget, the past is not just history. It is a warning. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.